Film patrons, creative patrons out in the universe. This is Liz Hinlein. I am the creative director and filmmaker at New York Film Academy. And I would love to present my creative visionary for this week, the amazing Emmy Award-winning, Oscar-nominated Joe Berlinger.
Hey, Liz.
Oh my God, I see you, Joe. Thank
How are
God.
you?
Yes.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's been a while.
I know. Joe and I know each other from many years ago when he was kind enough to trot around an idea for a TV series at the time, which was about dreams and the dreams of celebrities or famous people or creative people. And I kept thinking that, but you know, what they dream about, like Madonna, let's say, must be super, hopefully interesting, or super boring, but it'd be interesting to know what they know.
We should have made that show.
I know, we're bringing it back. We're bringing it back. I was also telling Joe I was inspired by his seminal series, Iconoclast, which was on Sundance. And wondering about that, how did you end up picking out your people for that? Because you had such interesting dynamics between your...
You know, initially it was hard to book the show, to be honest, because it was not a standard ask. You know, the standard talent ask, or somebody you want to interview, can you sit down for an interview for an hour? This was, you know, we want you to spend time with somebody that you're craving to spend time with and give us several days of your time. And so that was really hard to initially start booking. So we twisted Robert Redford's arm, who was the executive producer of the show, and begged him to reunite with Paul Newman because they hadn't been together in so long, even though they're good friends. And so the first episode, once we were able to say we had Robert Redford and Paul Newman coming together, you know, for the first episode, that kind of started to open some doors up. And it was a mix, you know, once the show hit its stride, people, you know, publicists started pitching us, which was nice, but that wasn't until season 2. So for season 1, we just went out to people we admired, and we, you know, we asked them, who is somebody that, you know, we don't want to do a standard bio show about your life and what everyone knows about you. We want to do something where we see a side of you that you don't normally see, you know, whether it's your philanthropy or your hobbies or whatever. And we want you to spend time with somebody you've always wanted to spend time with. And so that was appealing to a lot of people. So, you know, we got Eddie Vedder to spend time with Laird Hamilton because Eddie wanted to learn how to surf, and Laird's an amazing surfer. We got Richard Branson, you know, to agree to do it because he wanted to promote Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So that was an odd, unusual pairing, you know. Sean Penn was about to come out with the movie Into the Wild. And so even though he doesn't normally do television, he agreed to spend 5 days traveling back up to Alaska, where the bus that is the, people know the movie, there's a guy named Chris McCandless who died at the bus, lost his way, and there was a movie Into the Wild made about it. And so John Krakauer, who wrote the book, and Sean Penn thought it would be fun to hang out and go back to the real bus. And so we just found ways of appealing to people with an untraditional approach, which is, we don't care about why you're famous, and we know why you're famous. We're not going to get into that. We're going to get into a side of you that people don't know, and a side that you want to pursue yourself. Like, who do you want to hang out with? And yeah, I love that show. You know, every time I was shooting an episode, and I think we made 30 episodes over 6 years. No, 36 episodes. We did 6 a year for 6 years. And I directed, I think, about 80% of them. Every time we shot one, I would giggle to myself that I'm actually getting paid to go have these crazy adventures with people. It was a lot of fun.
And was there anyone that you were like intimidated by? Like, you're like, oh my God, we got XYZ.
Intimidated. Yeah, almost every one of them. But at a certain point, you know, because the whole vibe of the show was we're all regular people doing regular things, you know, we were able to tame it. But yeah, it was Look, I'm intimidated every day I walk onto a set, even after 30 years. I think that's good energy to have, is to be intimidated and like, how am I going to get through my day? Particularly on scripted stuff where you have a huge page count to get through. So I actually think intimidation is healthy. And even after 3 decades, you know, I walk on the set and look around and say, oh, I got to be a leader. Okay. And that's intimidating. So, but it's good intimidation.
Oh, I love that, because I always get the butterflies, and then I'm always like, oh, maybe the cool kids don't have the butterflies.
You know, everyone gets nervous.
So tell me, you know what I was,
If you're not getting nervous, you have a problem. If you're not nervous at the start, I mean, but you know, nervous energy can destroy and nervous energy can propel. You have to learn how to harness it.
exactly. So speaking on walking onto sets, I was really, truly blown away by the performances you got from Zac Efron and Lily Collins. And I'm going to read it because I don't want to bastardize it. Your Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil movie,
Yeah.
which was, I mean, I would love to know how you as a documentary filmmaker prepared to work with actors and really got such beautiful, authentic, raw performances, especially from Lily.
Yeah. Yeah. They both were great and worked really hard. You know, the standard advice for when you're going to write, not that I wrote the script, I'm just trying to make a comparison. Standard advice when you're going to write something is to write what you know. So I took that philosophy into directing, you know, because I haven't done that much scripted material. So, you know, direct what you know, meaning I just had a very documentary, even though it doesn't look like a documentary, and the cinematography that Brandon Frost did was fantastic. I just treated the actors and the situation in a more documentary like manner, because, you know, for 30 years I've dropped into places, courtrooms or boardrooms or events, and, you know, as a documentarian, you have to, there's no reshooting and second takes. You have to like figure out, okay, here's the situation. How am I going to cover it? Where am I going to put the camera? And so I just kind of took that attitude into my scripted work, which means you still have to prepare. You know, you got to do a shot list and figure out what how you're going to shoot, how you're going to execute the day. But just like with an interview list, when you do a documentary interview, I always, you know, prepare by having an extensive question list. But the moment the interview starts, I throw the question list is like a security blanket to make sure you go through the mental exercise of knowing what you need to ask. But I'll throw that. The worst thing a documentary interviewer can do is stick to the question list, because if you're not listening to the conversation, you're missing the opportunity of taking the conversation to a place where you're surprised or don't know. You can't predict what people are going to say. So similarly, you know, I walked into each day of the movie very prepared with a game plan, because if the day wasn't working out, you got to have a plan, but totally ready to throw the plan out, which meant a couple of things. I don't like rehearsal. We did not rehearse, other than, of course, we sat around the table and talked about, and look, this is how I made a film. Everyone should make a film however they're comfortable making a film. Some directors, you know, every word on the script has to be delivered exactly as written. People rehearse it to death. That's great for their filmmaking. So I'm not telling people how to make a film, but for me, you know, I'm very loose with the script and open to improvisation. I hate rehearsal because, you know, I just want it fresh, like, documentary freshness to discover on the set. You know, we still had rehearsals, but rehearsal just was the three of us sitting around the table talking about the character and talking about what we want to get out of the movie, and being very loose and just kind of answering any questions they might have about story details, but I would never put it on its feet and actually do a rehearsal. So, you know, on the day, you know, I was looking to capture something fresh and new that they hadn't done before because there was no rehearsal. You know, I go 70% of the time, even though I walked into the set having imagined how I want to shoot it. Once we do a rehearsal, because you have to rehearse right before you shoot, not to be confused with rehearsals prior to the, your shoot day, but on the day you have to rehearse the scene so that the cameramen and all the technical people can walk through it and see what you're about to shoot. But most of the time, how I envisioned the shooting in my mind's eye prior to the day, I would often throw out and react to what the actors were doing in the rehearsal and then change my camera plan accordingly. So I just kept it really loose, and improvisational, and encouraged the actors to go off book, off script if they felt they had something different and better to say. So I just kept it really loose, to be honest, and documentary-like. Even though it was shot beautifully, it doesn't look like a documentary.
Going on that, I am so curious that you had this beautiful moment with Lily in the bathtub where she was weeping.
Yeah.
And so raw. So how did you go into that, knowing that you have to deliver Lily weeping? How did you get her to that place?
We just had a chat about it before. Actually, that day was going long, and we were really under pressure to knock it off pretty quickly. So we only had like 2 takes really before I had to pull the plug on the day, because we were already way over. That movie was, people think it's a more expensive movie than it really was, but we had a really tight budget. We just talked about what we needed. It was also a closed set because she was not wearing clothes. And so that adds, a little pressure to the day. But she often nailed things in the first take. It was amazing. And we just, had a conversation about what we needed, and she delivered. I think the more interesting technique related to her performance is in another scene, which is, because I was also doing Bundy Tapes, the docu-series. I had just done it. I had lots of archival footage that, and proprietary archival footage that most people hadn't seen, because I was in the middle of editing the docu-series, Conversations with a Killer. So I gave all of the actors like lots, and the art department, etc., lots of archival footage, except Lily, because Lily's character is supposed to believe in Zach's or Bundy's innocence. And I really wanted that relationship to feel real. I didn't allow her, and I forbade her at the beginning of the process to look at anything negative about Bundy. Mm-hmm. But my favorite scene in the movie is, at the end of the film, when she confronts him and he finally lets her know that, yes, I did all these terrible things. And there's a scene where she runs down the hallway and pieces it all together and realizes everything about her relationship had a different meaning. And she now emotionally understands what she intellectually knew, that she was living with this horrible killer. So right before we shot that moment where she's running down the hallway, that's when I took my laptop and I just scrolled through some of the most horrific images that I had forbade her from watching, and said, hey, this is what this guy did, And that, I think she would tell you, that was really powerful for her, because she, for the first time, allowed herself to see the horror of what Bundy did in real life, and that informed that moment.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I always talk to the NYFA students about the filmmaker being the magician, and then you're pulling it out of the hat, and ta-da! And now this is how we'll get the performance.
Yeah.
So did you plan, how did it come that you were doing a documentary and a fiction piece on the same subject matter? Was this a master plan? Did it just sort of happenstance?
Yeah, it sounds like some big master plan on my part to kind of control Bundy in 2019. And both of the films came out more or less at the same time. And while it all worked out beautifully, it was all just happenstance and timing and luck and taking advantage of an opportunity. Basically, in 2017, I think, the authors of, there's a book called Conversations with a Killer. It had a different subtitle then. Now I'm forgetting what the subtitle is. The subtitle of the show is the Ted Bundy Tapes, but this was Conversations with a Killer, something else. I'm embarrassed, I'm forgetting. But in any event, that was a book written several decades ago And the author, Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, the two authors, but it was mainly Stephen, reached out to me and said, I wrote this book a couple of decades ago. He was a fan of Paradise Lost, and I knew the book. And I said, sure, I know the book. And he said, well, I just found the tapes in his closet or something. And, in this new era of true crime, Netflix binging, do you think there's a TV show to be made about Bundy? And I said, well, the bar for Bundy is awfully high because so much has been done, but send me the tapes and I will see what I think. And he sent me the tapes, and because of not the honesty, because he's also often an unreliable narrator, but because of the candor in the tapes, what was being said, how he was saying it, I called him back and I said, yeah, I think there's a terrific show here. And so we pitched it to Netflix, and Netflix bought it pretty quickly. So this is around January of 2017, we started working on the doc series. And by April, I was just having lunch with my agent in California, Michael Cooper, who is my motion picture agent. And I hadn't done a movie in a really long time. And I said to him, we're just talking about, should we get a movie off the ground? But I was explaining to him that I'm working on this Bundy thing that just is mind-boggling, and I think it's going to be fantastic. And maybe we should be looking in the true crime space for a movie. And that made him remember that there was this blacklisted script, the Hollywood Blacklist. In case people don't know what that is, it's a list of scripts that executives like, but for one reason or the other, they've been hard to get off the ground. So it's called the Hollywood Blacklist. And, either money fell apart for the movie, or talent fell apart, or there's some problem, and they're problem scripts that people like. So he sent me, he said, there's a Bundy script called Extremely Wicked. I said, oh, send it to me. And I don't think he was necessarily even sending it to me like, oh, let's go make a movie, because by definition, the Hollywood Blacklist means it's a script that's problematic, but he just thought I should read it. And I read it on the way home, flying home, and somewhere over Denver, I texted him and I said, oh my God, this is amazing. Let's figure out how to get this made. And getting movies off the ground take forever. You're endlessly pushing a boulder up a hill. Getting an independent film off the ground is, the documentary business makes much more sense and is much more logical than the scripted business, because you have to find the talent, and then you have to find the money. And by the time you get the talent to say yes, meaning an actor, the money falls apart, or vice versa. It's just, it takes years to get a movie put together, unless you're Steven Spielberg or Steven Soderbergh or whatever. It doesn't just have to be Steven, by the way. It can be, So, I had no reason to think this film would be made anytime soon, but I got on the phone with the producer who held the rights, a guy named Michael Costigan. This is now third week of April 2017. And I said, hey, I really love the script. Here are the reasons I think it might have had problems getting made before. And I gave him my take, which I won't bore people with now. But this is how I would do this script and how I would change it up a little bit to get it made, because I think this is the problem. And maybe I'll say, in a nutshell, because I think it might be interesting, the original script for Extremely Wicked depended upon the reader not knowing it was Bundy until the very end of the movie. And I think, in this day and age, and we saw when Zac Efron signed up for the movie, there was worldwide headlines, Zac Efron playing Ted Bundy. So in this day and age, you can't keep a secret like that of what a movie is ultimately about. So basically my take, which is a little more complicated than what I'm about to say, but just to keep it concise, I said, let's lean into the fact that it's Bundy at the beginning of the movie, and the girlfriend doesn't know, even though that was baked into the DNA, but it was the audience and Lily, or whoever was going to play Lily, the girlfriend, not knowing it's Bundy. I said, the audience should know, and let's lean into that. But it's Lily who is, the girlfriend, who is unaware of who she's living with, and lean into that and give the audience the same ride as, as the main character. anyway, whatever I said, he said, great. And then by coincidence, a week later at a weekly meeting at CAA, my agent said, because they all talk about what their clients are doing, my agent said, hey, Joe's thinking about doing Extremely Wicked. And Zach's agent said, oh, Zach's looking to do something different. Do you think Joe would be interested in him reading the script? I said, yeah, that could be amazing. And to his credit, Zach read the script pretty quickly. We got on the phone, had a great conversation. So within 3 weeks of me having first read the script, Zach said yes. And that was like a week before Cannes. And as many of you know, Cannes is not just a famous film festival, but it's also the major marketplace where movie rights are bought and sold to make movies. And within the first 2 days of Cannes, we sold the film. And that was like 5 weeks from the moment I read the script to the moment it was a greenlit movie, which will never happen again in my career and never really should happen, but it did. So then I found myself, oh my goodness, I've just committed to doing this movie, but I'm still doing the documentary. But it all kind of worked out. And by the time, and the movie got pushed, originally the movie was going to shoot in October of 2017. And that would have really conflicted with the doc schedule, but we pushed it until January. The doc was largely rough cut by the time I went off to go prep for the feature film. And that was perfect because, a director of a movie of any subject really needs to be an expert in the subject, but I was truly now an expert because I had just spent, most of the year doing that doc series. And anytime a department head, like art department or, makeup, whatever, needed information, we had this amazing archival footage and all these reference stills. So the film actually on a very limited budget looks extremely authentic to the real story, which is one of the things I'm proud of because it has a great look, it has an authentic look, and it was, not an expensive film.
Oh, it's amazing. That's such a Cinderella story. And
Will never happen again.
You mentioned just a business thing I'm curious about. You mentioned Netflix a couple times.
Yeah.
Do you think Netflix has changed the game for documentary filmmakers?
Oh my God, Netflix has been the definitive game changer, and other streamers as well. And, but, look, when I started making films, my first documentary was Brothers Keeper. We shot it in 1990 on 16 millimeter film. That's how long ago that was. And in those days, if you weren't selling your documentary to HBO or PBS, you weren't selling your documentary. There was no such thing as unscripted series that we binge watch in the way that we talk about today. There was occasionally, a series here, and in 1992, MTV did The Real World. So there was some limited activity, but nothing like it is today. But, when Netflix got into original programming and started, what people don't get is the reason Netflix, and streaming in general has made such a difference is instead of going for a domestic audience, Netflix was building out a global audience. And so like 110 million people saw Bundy Tapes on Netflix, which is insane. So by going for a global audience, the growth is virtually unlimited right now in terms of building an audience. And so, streaming, I think, ramped up production, and then all the other players, HBO, Showtime, et cetera. And look, HBO had a major role. Sheila Nevins and HBO from, the 80s on had a huge role to play in the popularization of the documentary. So it's not just Netflix, but I think streaming really accelerated the trend because you're going for this global audience. And now with Netflix spending so much, everyone else has jumped into the game to up their game. And there's literally 10 times more production going on right now than when I started in this business. And, there's a lot more filmmakers too, so there's a lot more competition. But I think streaming and Netflix, really was the game changer for why we're in like peak television land right now.
So do you see like the form changing, that now that narrative and documentary are now sort of combining a lot, and the audiences are more sophisticated, so it doesn't have to be one or the other?
Well, I think it is one or the other in terms of, I mean, a documentary is still a documentary and a movie is still a movie, but I think each of them are borrowing techniques from one another at a much greater rate, and audiences are much more sophisticated. I mean, look, Brothers Keeper was an attempt to blur the lines um, of technique. You know, we did things in a documentary in 1992 that today are very commonplace, but at the time Brothers Keeper came out were highly criticized. Like, we had an original music score, and people said, well, you can't have an original music score in a documentary because that's subjective and makes you feel a certain way, and that's not journalistic. And we had a really compelling opening title sequence to our doc. You can't have an opening title sequence in a documentary. That opening title sequence in Brothers Keeper is tame by today's comparison of documentary opening title sequences. So I've always been interested in pushing the form. You still have to be truthful in a documentary. You can't make things up, and you're still bound by rules of journalism. But I think documentarians, you know, are much more aware these days of dramatic structure and of borrowing from the tools of the scripted filmmaker. Again, not making things up and scripting things, but things like music score and lush cinematography and all, you know, all sorts of things that a few years ago you didn't have to do. And similarly, I think scripted filmmakers, you know, from the now ubiquitous, including me, I did it too, the now ubiquitous documentary footage during the end credits of a movie to, you know, borrowing techniques of, you know, unscripted filmmakers. The difference, though, and what concerns me is a little bit as a documentarian, is I think it's harder and harder to find authenticity in documentary subjects. There's such a pressure for production value, for example. You know, I walk onto my set of a documentary interview, and in the old days, it would be, you know, you just sit somebody down with natural light and you don't worry about production value, and you just get some raw authenticity out of people. Now there's such pressure for everything to look A level that, you know, I have, you know, big lighting and grip crew and lights and, you know, all that production makes the subject feel like the pressure that, oh God, you know, there's a movie being made here when it's just a documentary interview. And I think, you know, and also people are so media savvy today versus 20 years ago. And cameras are ubiquitous. I mean, you pick up, everyone's filming everything today, that I think in documentary, when you're following a story, people are much more conscious of the camera. And they're just like we curate kind of a fake life on Instagram. Like, isn't my life wonderful? I mean, that's what Instagram's about. I'm guilty as charged, but you know, I just think, you know, people are it's just harder. Look, Brothers Keeper, again, I keep pointing to that film because it was my first film. It was such an amazing experience, but those farming brothers had no idea what it was to be making a film. We didn't bring in a lot of equipment. We shot handheld 16 and barely any other equipment, didn't light. You know, we didn't wire them up with lavs. You know, it was just a shotgun mic on a Nagra and just got some raw, unvarnished reality. And I think that's harder and harder to come by these days, you know, depending on the story you're covering. Like if you're, you know, if you're covering an event, like you know, I have some friends who are covering COVID in the hospitals, and you know, if you're covering Tiananmen Square or, you know, the revolution in Cairo, I mean, obviously you're documenting an event and you're getting real stuff, but generally these character-driven documentaries, I think people are so aware of, oh, I'm in a documentary, that you're not always getting unvarnished reality. So that's my concern about the merging of the two kind of disciplines of, you know, high-end production value from the scripted world into documentary.
Well, also coming from, you know, reality TV a couple years ago was completely overblown.
Yeah.
And so now, and it seemed like every human wanted to be a star on the planet, no matter where they lived. They'd all seen the Kardashians. So it is hard to keep that naivete and that authenticity. And you really have to dig into different, you know, deeper into cultures to find that. That said, what, you were mentioning when we were talking earlier that you're working on some really exciting stuff that you're passionate about. Can you tell us a little bit about what's your next endeavors?
Well, I can't, unfortunately, I can't tell you the subject matter because Netflix doesn't want me to, but I think I mentioned it in context of, this environment obviously is tough for production, and I wonder what production is going to look like when we come out of it. But, I'm grateful that I'm actually still working because we figured out with Netflix how to keep several shows going, even though we wouldn't normally start editing now because we haven't acquired the bulk of the footage. You want to shoot most of your stuff before you start editing. We figured out on 2 shows how to, how to keep the show on the railroad tracks, how to edit as far as we can, and which will take us probably till the end of June or mid-July. And if there's production happening by then, which I doubt, then we can continue working. And if not, we'll go dark for a period. And then the one show I can talk about, I can't tell you the date it will air. And I was a producer on it, not the director. Lisa Bryant directed it. We did a 4-part series on Jeffrey Epstein. And that will be coming out at some point, this year. I can't tell you when, not because I'm being coy, but Netflix does not want me to. But what was interesting is that show was picture locked, like ready to go into post-production for color correct, sound mixing, online editing, graphics, music, all the things you do to a show. After everyone agrees that this is the edit. So we were ready to go into post right when the hammer came down and New York got locked down. So, I'm with Radical Media, and the guys at Radical, did an amazing job of figuring out how to get color correct into somebody's apartment and sound mixing and all this stuff that happens in these big suites that well, all was done remotely. And so we ended up, delivering and doing all the post-production over these last 4 weeks, remotely under these conditions so that the show will not be delayed in its airing. So that was pretty amazing. I mean, it is amazing, not that Saturday Night Live should stay on the path that it's on now, but it is amazing how people are adapting. And, I do wonder what the impact is going to be on how things are done in the future. I think some changes are being accelerated that will, in our business, that are going to be permanent. The ascendancy of Netflix and streaming, I think has been, this trend has been accelerated. I think that's not going away. I think it's going to take a long time for a big crowd of people to be in a movie theater again. What is that going to mean? And already theatricality was, being challenged and ghettoized into a certain kind of either big Hollywood tentpole kind of movie or some special event. What is that trend going to be in the future? A big part of Hollywood is like old guard Hollywood, big bloated, debt-laden companies doing things in a non-economically, efficient manner. And lots of people are losing their jobs, and there's a big shakeout right now. I don't think a lot of those jobs, many of those jobs, well, I don't know, I think a portion of those jobs aren't coming back, and that we are going to see a different way of doing things. If you're a content creator, I think you're in a good position. If you're an executive at a big bloated company, I think, the future may not be that bright. So I wonder what all these changes are going to bring.
Very true, very true. If you're a scrappy filmmaker, you'll still be a scrappy filmmaker, no matter what's going on with COVID. There's a ton of questions, but I'm going to, from our global audience, but I'm going to read one. Some Kind of Monster was an incredibly important movie for many rock and metal fans my age, as it was our first exposure to Metallica. What is your fondest memory, most potent memory from working with Metallica? Good question.
Good question. Lots of great memories. I think I think, well, oh, there's so many memories. You see it in the movie. We had shot a bunch of stuff, and we were making this film. Well, first of all, the whole film was made by accident. So, Metallica. My relationship with Metallica started because while we were cutting Paradise Lost about the West Memphis Three, we had laid in Metallica tracks as temp music, never imagining they would ever give us the music, because at that time they had never licensed their music to any film, and I didn't know them, and I figured they wouldn't care about this, case. But I reached out to the band and I said, "Look, your lyrics are being introduced into a murder trial as evidence that these guys are killers, which is why we wanted their music. And how absurd is that somebody's musical choice is actually being entered into evidence to show that you're a killer?" And that argument resonated with them. And by some weird coincidence, the band's manager, Cliff Bernstein, was a huge fan of Brothers Keeper, our previous film. So they actually engaged in conversation. We showed them the rough cut of the film. And we were the first film they ever gave music to for Paradise Lost, which was a few years before the Metallica film. And they gave us the music for free. They could have charged us hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that kind of started the relationship. And then the whole Metallica film happened by accident. So I guess this would be my favorite memory, is that, I flew out to San Francisco to shoot as a favor to Lars. Lars said, "Hey, we're going into the studio for the first time in 5 years, and we want to just get a little B-roll," because back then they were still selling physical CDs. Digital music was, not quite where it, wasn't happening as a business. But Napster was nipping at the heels of the music industry. And so they wanted a little 20-minute kind of like featurette B-roll of going behind the scenes of them recording their new album, which would be slapped on the back of their CD that comes out, because the world was still in the world of selling physical CDs. So as I land in San Francisco, I say, "Hey, Lars, I'm here." And he's, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, Jason Newsted, the bassist, just quit the band, and I'm not sure we're doing the record. And, sorry, man." And so we went out for a drink, and he said, as a by the way, the management's hiring this performance enhancement coach. I said, "What?" And so I kind of pushed my way into that first therapy session, not knowing what we were doing or why I was here, but I just felt like we should be covering this, and started filming it. And it turned out to be this crazy 3-year adventure. So I guess that's my favorite memory, is just how the whole thing started. It was just so coincidental. And that's why I think the film is so authentic, because we didn't, if I called them up and said, "Hey, I want to make a documentary about you guys falling apart and having therapy," and, they never would have approved it. And B, it would have been too predetermined what the mission. I just kind of was there with a camera, and it just turned into a 3-year adventure. So anyway, that was a long answer, so I apologize.
That was a great answer. Do you rely, when you hear a story or you see a moment, is this like intuition, or is this now experience that you're like, ding, ding, story, ding, ding, interest? Or is it like emotional, or is it logical, or is it a mixture?
Well, fairly recently, I've come to I used to be frustrated because the things I thought were great ideas, like our idea that we pitched 15 years ago, I thought people would take it. So I pitch things all the time, and I'm like, "Don't you get it?" And people, so I've only recently come to the conclusion, and this may sound too, out there for people, but I've come to the conclusion that for me, not for other people, I feel like my subjects choose me, as opposed to I choose the films that get made. Like, I bang my head against the wall on certain subjects, and they never get made, that I think they should. And certain films, like the Metallica thing, just the doors open. Why? I didn't try very hard to get, I was there. I had a drink with Lars. The next day I'm at the Ritz-Carlton in a hotel room with these people, and the film starts. The films that tend to happen are the ones that it's not that we don't do work to make them happen, but the doors just kind of open. And you know, only fairly recently in my career, in the last couple of years, have I come to the conclusion that actually every film I've made has been an important lesson. And it's why I love the genre and why I love having, you know, had the life I've had. It's a lesson I needed to learn at that point. Um, you know, Brothers Keeper, making a film about smelly old farm brothers who never changed their clothes, who, if you were, you know, I don't know if people remember, I've seen the film, but they lived at the end of a dirt road. And as you're driving down that dirt road to go to their shack with no running water and no heat in upstate New York, when it gets really cold, if you're driving down that road, there's rusted out old stoves and refrigerators in the high grass as you're getting there. The first time we went there, they had an animal that was freshly slaughtered hanging from a tree. You see a scene like that in the movie. And under normal circumstances, you would think, oh my God, I got to get out of here. I don't feel safe. We didn't get out. These people ended up being the sweetest, nicest people I've ever met. And that was a lesson for me in not being judgmental towards other people, you know. And every film has been a lesson that I needed to learn, that I was ready to learn at a certain specific time. That's how I've processed why certain films just kind of happen and certain films I try really hard and don't happen.
Interesting. Anyway. And so my last question is, so 2 Ted Bundy films, what were you supposed to learn?
That's a good question. That doesn't necessarily fit in the same bucket. For me, those films, you know, before I decided to make either of those films, I called up actually it was before the tapes. I called up both of my daughters, who are very intelligent. At the time, they were, one was a junior in college and the other was a second year of her PhD. And I said to each of them, sorry, this was not after the tape, this is when I was trying to decide to do the movie. I said to them, do you know who Ted Bundy is? So these are women in their 20s, going to fine schools, who are very bright. Didn't know who Ted Bundy was. I said, ask some of your friends. And very few of their friends knew who Ted Bundy was. You know, a few, oh, isn't he a serial killer? But for the most part, largely unknown. And so for me, telling the Ted Bundy story through the perspective of the girlfriend who believes in this guy who's just charming and nice and likable, but turns out to be this horrible person, I think that's a lesson that I wanted my daughters to know, that just because somebody looks and acts a certain way, it doesn't mean you should trust them, which is such a basic lesson in life. But in this age of internet catfishing and Uber drivers pretending to be Uber drivers, and, you know, that poor woman who was killed, you know, I think I wanted my daughters and my daughter's generation to be reminded that you can't judge a book by its cover. Just because somebody is charming and good looking doesn't mean you should trust them. And that was how the movie was designed. And anyway, that's the reason I felt good about making that show. Despite people, you know, look, a lot of people love the movie. A lot of people found it very controversial, like we're giving a platform to Bundy, we're disrespecting the victims by, you know, and to me, it's just the opposite. A lot of people were bothered that the movie didn't have violence until the very end, and that's, you know, that somehow that's disrespectful to the victim by not having violence, like we're making light of what Bundy did. And to me, it's just the opposite. To me, it's much more disrespectful to victims and their families to portray the worst moment of somebody's existence, when they're being raped and murdered by a psychopath. You really want to have a movie loaded with that? To me, it's a much more interesting approach to lull the audience into Zach's performance, into making them think, gee, maybe he didn't do it because he's so nice and he's so charming. And by the end of the movie, when Lily realizes the truth and runs down that hallway, the audience too should feel betrayed and disgusted that they were actually lulling themselves into a sense of, well, maybe he didn't do it. You know, that younger generation who's not familiar with the story, that was how a lot of people reacted to the film. It's like, oh my God, I thought he was innocent up until the last moment. That's the perfect reaction. That's not glorifying Bundy. That's showing how real evil operates. You know, to me, real, you know, the people you least expect and most often trust are the perpetrators of evil, as I have learned in my 30 years of crime filmmaking. You know, the priest who commits pedophilia. I mean, what a horrible betrayal of trust. I'm sure on Sunday at church service, he's a wonderful guy that you admire, but he has this horrible dark secret. You know, that's the nature of evil, and that's the lesson I wanted my kids to have.
That's amazing, and really compassionate also to put out work like that. Well, Joe, thank you. You were
Thank you very
awesome.
much.
This
Good
was
to see you
super
again.
great. We will be in touch.
Cool.
And thanks everyone for the 2020 series, coming and seeing it. Next week, we will have an amazing songwriter, producer, Peter Zizzo, who discovered Avril Lavigne.
Ooh,
So we will talk
good.
about how you discover talent. Thanks,
Bye.
Joe. Be safe.
Thanks.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.